The teacup shattered against the marble floor the moment Eleanor Whitmore heard the front door open earlier than expected. She had not planned for the Duke to arrive before 4 o'clock, and now there was no time to hide the small chip in the porcelain set, or to warn her sister that her hair had come loose from its pins. Her hands moved fast, sweeping the broken pieces into her apron, her heart hammering as footsteps crossed the hallway outside the drawing room. Cassandra Whitmore was upstairs, unaware that her future had just walked through the door, 30 minutes ahead of schedule. Eleanor pressed her palm to her chest, willing herself to breathe, and called out to the maid to fetch a fresh cup before anyone noticed the delay. This was not how she had imagined the day beginning, and she had barely a moment to compose herself before the housekeeper announced the Duke of Ashmere had arrived. Eleanor smoothed her plain gray dress, tucked a stray curl behind her ear, and stepped into the hallway with a calm expression that hid the storm inside her. She had learned long ago that panic served no one, least of all a family whose fortunes depended on this single visit going well. Her father's business had suffered 2 difficult years in a row, and everyone in the house understood, without needing to say it aloud, that Cassandra's marriage to a man of wealth and title was the only rope pulling them back from the edge. The Duke stood in the entrance hall, removing his gloves, his dark coat still damp from the light rain outside. He was younger than Eleanor had expected from the rumors that traveled through town, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the house, before he had even spoken a single word. When he looked at Eleanor, there was no dismissal in his gaze, no quick glance past her toward the stairs, where he might expect the more celebrated sister to appear. Instead, he studied her for a moment longer than was polite, as though trying to place her. "Forgive the early hour," he said, his voice low and even. "My business in town finished sooner than planned, and I did not wish to keep your family waiting on my account." Eleanor curtsied, her mind racing to recall the correct words for a moment such as this, words she had rehearsed for her sister but never for herself. "You are most welcome, Your Grace. Please, allow me to show you to the drawing room while my sister is informed of your arrival." He nodded and followed her down the corridor, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Eleanor felt the weight of his attention on her back the entire way, though she told herself it meant nothing. Noble men often studied a house before deciding whether its occupants deserved their respect. It was not about her. It could not be about her. The drawing room had been arranged with care that morning, fresh flowers set upon the table, the good chairs pulled close to the window where the light was most flattering. Eleanor guided him to a seat and excused herself to fetch the tea, grateful for the excuse to leave the room and steady her nerves. In the kitchen, her mother waited, wringing her hands. "Is he cross that we were unprepared?" her mother asked, worry etched into every line of her face. Eleanor shook her head and lied smoothly, telling her mother that all was well, that the Duke seemed a patient man. She did not mention the way he had looked at her, because there was nothing to mention. It was a foolish thought, and she pushed it away as she arranged the tea tray herself, rather than trust it to a nervous maid. When she returned to the drawing room, Cassandra had still not appeared, and the silence between Eleanor and the Duke stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. She poured his tea exactly as she had heard he preferred, a small amount of milk added before the tea itself, a detail she had gathered from a passing comment weeks earlier, when their neighbor had mentioned his habits during a dinner conversation. She had remembered it without meaning to, the way she remembered most small, useful things. "You take note of details," the Duke said, watching her hands as she set the cup before him. "Most hostesses ask how I prefer my tea rather than simply knowing." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I overheard it once, Your Grace. I did not mean to presume." "You did not presume," he said. "You listened. There is a difference, and it is rarer than you might think." Before she could answer, quick footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Cassandra swept into the room in a gown of pale blue, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the short notice. She was beautiful, in the effortless way that drew every eye in a room, and Eleanor watched the Duke rise to greet her with proper courtesy, the kind of polished manners expected of a man in his position. "Your Grace," Cassandra said, her voice bright and practiced. "What a pleasant surprise to see you so early in the day." "The pleasure is entirely mine," he replied, and Eleanor noted that his tone had shifted, become more formal, more distant than the words he had spoken to her only moments before. She told herself this was simply proper behavior, the correct way to address the woman he had come to court, and she stepped back toward the corner of the room where she belonged, ready to refill cups and remain unseen. For the next hour, Eleanor observed the conversation from her quiet position near the window, refreshing tea and offering small biscuits when the tray grew low. Cassandra spoke of the recent assembly ball, of the new fashions arriving from the city, of a novel she had recently finished, though Eleanor suspected she had read only the first chapters before setting it aside out of boredom. The Duke listened with polite attention, asking questions at appropriate moments, laughing softly when Cassandra made a clever remark about a mutual acquaintance. Yet several times during the visit, Eleanor caught him glancing toward her corner of the room, not with the dismissive glance of a man checking whether a servant needed attending to, but with something closer to curiosity. Once, when Cassandra excused herself briefly to fetch a shawl she claimed she suddenly needed despite the warmth of the room, the Duke turned his full attention to Eleanor. "You have not spoken much this afternoon," he said. "I am not the one you came to see, Your Grace," Eleanor answered honestly, surprising herself with her own directness. "Perhaps not," he said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "But that does not mean your thoughts are without value. What did you think of the novel your sister mentioned?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether answering honestly would embarrass her sister. "I confess I have not read it myself," she admitted, "though I understand it deals with themes of duty and sacrifice, which seem to be popular subjects this season." "Themes close to your own life, perhaps," he observed, and something in his tone made Eleanor's breath catch, though she could not say exactly why. Before she could respond, Cassandra returned, and the moment passed as quickly as it had arrived. The visit continued for another half hour before the Duke rose to take his leave, thanking the family for their hospitality and promising to call again the following week. Eleanor walked him to the door, as was her habit, while Cassandra remained in the drawing room, adjusting her appearance in the small mirror above the mantel. "Thank you for the tea," the Duke said quietly, as he accepted his hat and gloves from the waiting footman. "It was, without question, the finest cup I have had in recent memory." "It is only tea, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though her cheeks warmed at the compliment. "Perhaps," he said, pausing at the threshold, "but it was made with attention, and attention is not something easily purchased or imitated. Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore." He said her name, not her sister's, and something about the way he emphasized it lingered in Eleanor's mind long after his carriage had disappeared down the lane. She closed the door and stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, trying to convince herself that she had imagined more meaning in his words than had truly been there. That evening, as the family gathered for a simple dinner, her mother could speak of nothing but the visit. "Did he seem pleased?" she asked repeatedly. "Did he mention calling again soon? Was there any indication of his intentions toward Cassandra?" "He seemed a thoughtful man," Eleanor offered carefully, unwilling to share the strange warmth that had settled in her chest since his departure. "He asked good questions and listened well." Cassandra, for her part, seemed less enthusiastic than their mother expected. "He is pleasant enough," she said with a small shrug, "though I confess, I find conversation with him rather tiring. He asks too many questions and offers too few compliments." Their father, who had said little throughout dinner, finally spoke. "Compliments will not save this family, Cassandra. A title and fortune might. I trust you understand what is at stake should this match fail to progress." The table fell silent, the weight of unspoken worry pressing down on everyone present. Eleanor lowered her eyes to her plate, thinking of the way the Duke had looked at her hands as she poured his tea, the way he had called her attentive rather than simply capable. She told herself firmly that such thoughts were dangerous, that her role in this family had always been to support, never to be seen, and that any attention the Duke had shown her was surely nothing more than common courtesy, extended to the sister of the woman he intended to court. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor sat by her window, overlooking the quiet garden below. The moonlight cast long shadows across the hedges her father could no longer afford to have properly trimmed, and she thought of how different her life had become from what she once imagined as a girl. She had once believed she too might marry for affection, might have a home and family of her own, rather than existing as a quiet support to her sister's future. But circumstances had shifted those dreams aside long ago, replaced instead with duty and practicality. She thought of the Duke's steady gaze, the careful way he had asked about her thoughts on the novel, the compliment about her tea that had felt somehow larger than the words themselves suggested. She reminded herself sternly that such thoughts led nowhere good. He had come for Cassandra. Everyone understood this, including Eleanor herself, and no small kindness or fleeting glance would change the arrangement already understood between their families. Yet as she finally drifted toward sleep, she could not fully banish the memory of his voice saying her name, nor the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had followed her through the rest of the evening, like a candle she had not meant to light. The following morning brought fresh concerns. Her mother insisted the household prepare more thoroughly for the Duke's promised return the following week, determined that no early arrival would catch them unprepared again. Cassandra, though outwardly agreeable, spent considerably more time discussing an upcoming visit to her friend Grace Linfield than she did discussing the Duke's next call, a detail that troubled Eleanor, though she said nothing of it to her parents. As the days passed, Eleanor found herself once again managing the small details that made the household appear more prosperous than it truly was, mending a torn curtain herself, rather than paying for a seamstress, stretching the week's food budget to allow for a proper spread should the Duke return unexpectedly early again. She did not resent these tasks, having long ago accepted them as simply part of who she was within her family. Yet she noticed, more than she had before, how invisible such labor remained to everyone around her. It was Grace Linfield who first mentioned, during a brief visit to the Whitmore house, that town gossip had already begun circulating about the Duke's unusual attentiveness during his first call. He asked after the elder Miss Whitmore twice during the assembly last season, Grace said with a knowing smile, though I am certain it means nothing beyond simple politeness. Eleanor laughed off the comment, insisting it was surely nothing, though the words lodged themselves somewhere deep in her chest, refusing to be easily dismissed. She told herself she would think no more of it, that whatever attention the Duke had shown her was simply the natural courtesy of a well-mannered man, and that her duty remained clear, regardless of any fleeting warmth she had imagined in his gaze. Yet as the week drew toward his promised return, Eleanor found herself dressing with slightly more care than usual, choosing a ribbon she rarely wore, smoothing her hair with more attention than the occasion strictly required. She told herself it was simply pride, a desire to represent her family well. She did not allow herself to consider any other reason, though somewhere beneath her careful composure, a small and unfamiliar hope had already begun to stir, one she was not yet ready to name. The second visit arrived with far less warning than anyone expected, and this time it was Cassandra who was caught unprepared, still asleep well past the hour her mother had insisted she rise. Eleanor stood at the base of the stairs, calling up to her sister, while the Duke waited in the drawing room, and for the second time, in as many visits, it fell to Eleanor to greet him alone and keep him occupied until Cassandra could be roused and readied. I apologize for the delay, Your Grace, Eleanor said, entering the room with the tea tray already prepared, having learned from the previous visit not to leave such preparations to chance. My sister was resting after a late evening with friends and did not expect you quite so soon. There is no need to apologize, he said, rising briefly, before settling back into his chair. I find I do not mind the wait, particularly when the company proves interesting. Eleanor set the tray down and busied herself with pouring, grateful for the small task that gave her hands something to do besides betray her nerves. She had thought of him more than she wished to admit over the past week, and now, faced with his presence again, she found herself acutely aware of every word she spoke and every glance she offered. I understand you enjoy walking in the mornings, the Duke said unexpectedly, watching her pour his tea with the same careful attention she had shown before. Your neighbor mentioned it during a conversation we shared recently. Eleanor looked up, surprised. I do, Your Grace, though I confess I did not realize anyone had noticed such a small habit. Small habits often reveal more about a person than grand gestures, he said. I find myself curious about the paths you prefer. Do you walk toward the eastern fields or the river? The river, usually, Eleanor answered, unable to suppress a small smile at the memory of quiet mornings spent watching the water move past the old stone bridge. It is peaceful there, away from the noise of the house. Perhaps I might accompany you one morning, he suggested, his tone light, but his eyes steady upon her. Purely for the exercise, of course. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of Cassandra's rapid footsteps on the stairs interrupted the moment, and both of them turned toward the doorway as she entered, slightly breathless, her hair hastily arranged but her smile firmly in place. "Your Grace, forgive my tardiness," Cassandra said, sweeping into the room with practiced grace. "I had no idea the hour had grown so late." The Duke rose to greet her properly, and Eleanor retreated once again to her familiar position near the window, though the earlier conversation lingered in her mind throughout the remainder of the visit. She watched as Cassandra spoke of upcoming social engagements, of a new gown she had commissioned for the coming season, of gossip surrounding several other prominent families in town. The Duke listened politely, offering appropriate responses, yet Eleanor noticed he seemed less engaged than he had during their brief exchange only minutes before. Halfway through the visit, Cassandra made an offhand remark that caught Eleanor's attention. "I do wonder sometimes why gentlemen bother with morning walks at all," Cassandra said with a light laugh. "Such an unnecessary effort when one could simply enjoy a comfortable morning indoors." "Some find the effort worthwhile," the Duke replied evenly, and Eleanor caught the faintest flicker of something in his expression, though it passed quickly enough that she could not be certain what she had seen. As the visit continued, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of the differences between her sister's conversation and her own brief exchanges with the Duke. Cassandra spoke easily and confidently, filling silences with pleasant chatter about fashion and society, while Eleanor's own comments, when the Duke occasionally directed a question her way, tended toward more thoughtful observations about books, or the changing seasons, or the small concerns of managing a household with limited resources. She told herself this difference meant nothing, that gentlemen of the Duke's standing surely preferred lively conversation over quiet reflection, and that Cassandra's easy charm was precisely the quality that would secure the match their family so desperately needed. Yet she could not entirely dismiss the way the Duke's attention seemed to sharpen whenever she spoke, nor the manner in which he seemed to search for opportunities to draw her into the conversation, even when propriety suggested he should focus solely upon Cassandra. Near the end of the visit, as the Duke prepared to depart, he turned to Eleanor with a request that startled her. "I wonder, Miss Whitmore, whether you might recommend a book from your own reading. Your sister mentioned you often read while she attends to other pursuits, and I find myself in need of new material for the coming weeks." Cassandra's expression flickered briefly with something that might have been irritation, quickly smoothed over into polite interest. Eleanor felt the weight of the moment, aware that any recommendation she offered would draw attention away from her sister and toward herself, yet unable to think of a way to decline the direct question without seeming rude. "I recently finished a collection of essays on natural philosophy," Eleanor said carefully, "though I imagine it might not suit every reader's taste." "On the contrary," the Duke said, "I find such subjects endlessly interesting. Perhaps you might lend me your copy, if you are willing to part with it temporarily." Eleanor agreed, though she felt Cassandra's eyes upon her throughout the remainder of the exchange, and she resolved to be more careful in future conversations, to avoid drawing such direct attention from the Duke, regardless of how flattering his interest might feel. After his departure, Cassandra's mood shifted noticeably, her earlier bright chatter replaced by a quieter, more guarded demeanor. Eleanor noticed this change but said nothing, hoping the tension would pass on its own rather than growing into something more difficult to manage. That evening, as the sisters prepared for bed, Cassandra finally addressed the matter directly. "You seem to have made quite an impression on the Duke," she said, her tone carefully neutral though her words carried an unmistakable edge. "Perhaps you should be the one courting him instead of me." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten at the accusation, however lightly delivered. "That is not fair, Cassandra. I have done nothing to encourage his attention. I have only answered his questions honestly, as any polite hostess would." "Perhaps," Cassandra said, though her expression remained skeptical. "Still, I would ask that you consider your position within this family before answering quite so many questions in future. Mother and father are counting on this match, and I would hate for anything to interfere with it." Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken warning within her sister's words, and she resolved once again to withdraw further into the background during future visits, regardless of how the Duke's questions might tempt her toward conversation. Yet despite her resolution, she found herself unable to fully suppress the small flutter of warmth that had settled in her chest since his visit, nor the quiet hope that had begun, against her better judgment, to take root within her. Over the following days, Eleanor threw herself into household tasks with renewed determination, hoping the distraction of practical work might quiet the confusing feelings that had taken hold of her thoughts. She spent hours mending linens, organizing the pantry, and assisting the cook with meal preparations, all while carefully avoiding any mention of the Duke or his upcoming visits. Yet her efforts to distract herself proved only partially successful. Late at night, alone in her room, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the conversation about morning walks, to the way his voice had softened when he asked about the book she preferred, to the strange sense of being truly seen that had accompanied their brief exchanges. She told herself these feelings were foolish, that nothing could come of them regardless of how genuine the Duke's interest might seem, and that her duty to her family far outweighed any personal desire she might harbor. Still, when the morning arrived for her usual walk toward the river, Eleanor found herself glancing toward the lane leading from the main road, half expecting, half hoping, to see a familiar carriage approaching. No carriage appeared that morning, and she told herself firmly that this was for the best, that any encouragement of the Duke's evident interest would only complicate matters further and potentially jeopardize her sister's prospects. Yet 3 days later, as she walked her familiar path along the riverbank, enjoying the quiet solitude of the early hour, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from behind, and turned to find the Duke himself, dismounted and leading his horse, walking toward her with an expression of quiet pleasure. "I hope you do not mind the intrusion," he said, falling into step beside her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "I found myself unable to resist the temptation of joining you, despite knowing it might not be entirely proper." Eleanor's heart raced, torn between the pleasure of his company and the awareness of how such a meeting might appear should anyone witness it. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I fear this might not be wise, given the circumstances of your visits to my family." "Perhaps not," he agreed, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Yet I find myself increasingly unable to ignore certain truths, regardless of how inconvenient they might prove." Eleanor said nothing, uncertain how to respond to such a statement, and they continued walking together in comfortable silence for several minutes before he spoke again, his words carrying a weight that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. "I did not come to your family's house seeking your sister, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "I came because of an introduction arranged by mutual friends, an introduction I now suspect was based on incomplete understanding of where my true interest would eventually settle." Eleanor stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat, as she turned to face him fully for the first time that morning. "Your Grace," she began, though she found herself unable to complete the thought, uncertain whether hope or fear dominated her racing heart in that uncertain moment beside the quiet river. The garden party had been planned for weeks, a grand affair hosted by Lord Henry Bellamy to celebrate his birthday, and every prominent family in the county had been invited to attend. Eleanor stood near the refreshment table, watching her sister move through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting acquaintances and accepting compliments on her appearance with the natural confidence that had always come easily to her. Since their conversation by the river, Eleanor had avoided being alone with the Duke, uncertain how to process his unexpected confession and unwilling to risk further complicating an already delicate situation. She had told herself repeatedly that his words had been born of momentary impulse rather than genuine intention, that a man in his position would not truly abandon a courtship already understood by both families in favor of a plain, practical elder sister with no dowry to speak of. Yet his words continued to echo in her mind regardless of how firmly she attempted to dismiss them. The Duke arrived at the party shortly after noon, immediately drawing attention from the assembled guests, who whispered speculatively about his continued interest in the Whitmore family. Cassandra moved quickly to greet him, linking her arm through his with practiced familiarity, as she guided him toward a group of her closest friends, eager to display the connection before the entire gathering. Eleanor remained near the edges of the party, as was her habit, content to observe rather than participate directly in the lively conversations occurring throughout the garden. She noticed, however, that Cassandra seemed unusually animated that afternoon, her laughter louder than necessary, her comments occasionally sharp in ways that seemed designed to draw attention rather than genuine amusement. As the afternoon progressed, Cassandra's mood grew increasingly erratic, fueled perhaps by nervousness about the Duke's uncertain intentions, or perhaps by something else entirely that Eleanor could not quite identify. During a conversation with several prominent guests, Cassandra made a careless remark about a mutual acquaintance's recent financial troubles, a comment that landed poorly among the assembled group and caused an uncomfortable silence to settle over the gathering. Eleanor, sensing the tension, quickly moved forward to redirect the conversation, offering a light comment about the beautiful weather, and the impressive arrangements Lord Bellamy had prepared for his celebration. The gathered guests responded gratefully to the change of subject, and the awkward moment passed without further incident, though Eleanor noticed several individuals glancing toward her with newfound appreciation for her quick thinking. The Duke, standing nearby throughout the exchange, said nothing at the time, though Eleanor caught his eye briefly as the conversation shifted, and something in his expression suggested he had noticed both Cassandra's misstep and Eleanor's smooth recovery with equal attention. Later that afternoon, as guests dispersed across the extensive gardens to enjoy the pleasant weather, Eleanor found herself walking alone along a quiet path, lined with roses, grateful for a moment of solitude away from the crowded gathering. She had not gone far when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find the Duke approaching, his expression thoughtful. "That was well handled earlier," he said, falling into step beside her without invitation. "Your sister's comment could have caused considerable embarrassment had you not intervened so quickly." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, though she attempted to deflect it with practiced modesty. "It was nothing, Your Grace, simply a small kindness among friends." "It was more than that," he said firmly. "It was grace under pressure, a quality I have come to value considerably during our brief acquaintance. I find myself increasingly certain of the thoughts I shared with you by the river, thoughts I have not been able to set aside despite considerable effort to do so." Eleanor stopped walking, her heart racing at the directness of his words. "Your Grace, please," she said, glancing anxiously toward the main gathering visible through the rose bushes. "Anyone might overhear such words, and the consequences for my family would be severe should rumors begin circulating about impropriety between us." "I understand your concern," he said, though his tone remained gentle rather than dismissive. "Yet I cannot continue pretending an interest in your sister that I do not genuinely feel, regardless of the complications such honesty might create for either of our families." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, they heard approaching voices, and both quickly separated, resuming a more appropriate distance, as several other guests rounded the bend in the path. The Duke offered a polite nod to the newcomers, before excusing himself, leaving Eleanor alone, with her racing thoughts and uncertain heart. She remained in the garden for several minutes longer, attempting to compose herself, before returning to the main gathering, aware that her sister would surely notice any lingering distress, and demand an explanation she was not prepared to offer. When she finally rejoined the party, she found Cassandra in conversation with several friends, her earlier animated mood replaced by something more subdued and watchful. "You disappeared for quite some time," Cassandra observed as Eleanor approached, her tone carrying an edge of suspicion that had not been present earlier in the day. "I trust you were not engaged in conversation with anyone in particular." Eleanor forced a light laugh, hoping to dismiss her sister's concern, without confirming or denying the accusation implicit in her words. "I simply needed a moment away from the crowd, Cassandra. The gathering has grown rather warm this afternoon." Cassandra studied her sister for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the calculation occurring behind her eyes, the growing suspicion that something had shifted between Eleanor and the Duke that threatened the careful arrangement their family had been counting upon. Neither sister spoke further of the matter that afternoon, though the tension between them remained palpable throughout the remainder of the celebration. As the party drew toward its conclusion, and guests began departing in their carriages, Eleanor overheard several conversations among the other attendees, quiet speculation about the Duke's evident distraction throughout the afternoon, and his apparent preference for conversation with the elder Whitmore sister, rather than the younger one he had ostensibly come to court. Such gossip, she knew, would inevitably reach her parents before long, and she dreaded the conversation that would surely follow once such rumors took root within their household. That evening, as the family gathered for a quiet dinner following the exhausting celebration, Cassandra's mood had grown noticeably cold, her earlier animation replaced by careful, measured responses to every question posed by their parents. Their mother, sensing the tension but unaware of its true cause, attempted to draw Cassandra into conversation about the Duke's continued attention. "He seemed quite taken with the garden today," their mother observed hopefully. "Did he mention anything further about his intentions during your conversation?" Cassandra's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly, before she responded with careful neutrality. "He seemed distracted throughout much of the afternoon, Mother. Perhaps something troubled him that had nothing to do with our family." Eleanor kept her eyes fixed upon her plate throughout this exchange, unwilling to meet her sister's gaze, or risk drawing further attention to the tension simmering beneath the surface of their conversation. She understood that Cassandra suspected the truth, or at least a significant portion of it, and she dreaded the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable between them. After dinner concluded, as Eleanor helped clear the table alongside the household staff, Cassandra found a moment to speak privately with her sister in the quiet kitchen, away from their parents' watchful attention.
"I saw you walking with him in the garden,"
Cassandra said quietly, her earlier suspicion now confirmed rather than merely implied. "Do not insult me by pretending otherwise, Eleanor. I may not always notice everything, but I am not blind to what has clearly developed between the two of you." Eleanor set down the dishes she had been carrying, understanding that further denial would serve no purpose now that Cassandra had witnessed the truth directly. "I never sought his attention, Cassandra," she said honestly. "I have tried repeatedly to discourage any interest he might feel, understanding full well what such attention would mean for our family's careful arrangements." "Perhaps you tried," Cassandra said, though her tone had softened somewhat from its earlier sharpness. "Yet clearly your efforts proved insufficient, given what I witnessed today. I do not know what to make of this situation, Eleanor, nor how we might proceed without causing significant damage to our family's prospects." The sisters stood in uncomfortable silence for several long moments, the weight of unspoken concerns hanging heavily between them. Eleanor felt torn between guilt over circumstances she had never sought to create, and a growing awareness that whatever connection had developed between herself and the Duke could not simply be dismissed or ignored, regardless of how inconvenient the timing might prove for everyone involved. Finally, Cassandra spoke again, her words carrying a weariness that surprised Eleanor given her sister's usual confident demeanor. "I confess," she said quietly, "I have never particularly wished for this match myself. Mother and father have pushed the arrangement forward with such determination that I never felt able to voice my own reservations, yet I find myself relieved, in a strange way, that circumstances may be shifting beyond my control." Eleanor stared at her sister in surprise, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected admission. "What do you mean, Cassandra? I thought you wished for this marriage as much as our parents did." Cassandra shook her head slowly, her expression revealing a vulnerability Eleanor had rarely witnessed from her confident younger sister. "I wish to please our parents," she admitted. "I wish to secure our family's future as expected of me. But affection, Eleanor, genuine affection for the man himself, that I have never truly felt, regardless of how convincingly I performed the role expected of me during his visits." The sisters remained in the quiet kitchen for a long while after this confession, the earlier tension between them slowly transforming into something more complicated. Neither fully resolved nor entirely comfortable, yet marked by an honesty that had been notably absent from their relationship in recent weeks. Eleanor understood that whatever happened next would require careful navigation, both for her own uncertain feelings and for the complex web of family expectations that continued to surround the entire situation, regardless of how genuine the connection between herself and the Duke might ultimately prove to be. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, delivered by a footman who had clearly been given instructions to place it directly into Cassandra's hands. Eleanor happened to be passing through the front hall when the delivery occurred, and through a simple miscommunication, the footman mistakenly placed the sealed envelope into Eleanor's waiting hands instead, assuming she was the intended recipient, given her proximity to the door. Eleanor glanced at the envelope, noticing the Duke's distinctive seal pressed into the wax, and assumed naturally that the letter was intended for her sister given the ongoing correspondence that had developed between Cassandra and the Duke over recent weeks. She carried it toward the drawing room where Cassandra sat reading, intending to deliver it promptly, yet as she walked, her eyes fell upon the exterior of the envelope, and she noticed with a start that her own name, not her sister's, had been carefully written across the front, in the Duke's distinctive hand. She stopped in the hallway, staring at the envelope in confusion, uncertain whether to open it immediately or seek clarification about the apparent error. After a long moment of hesitation, she broke the seal, telling herself that any correspondence addressed directly to her deserved to be read regardless of how unusual the circumstances of its delivery had proven. The letter began formally enough, with polite inquiries about her health and her family's continued well-being, yet as Eleanor read further, the tone shifted into something far more personal than she had anticipated. The Duke wrote of their conversation by the river with evident fondness, recalling specific details of her observations about the natural philosophy essays she had lent him, and expressing genuine appreciation for the depth of her thinking on subjects most young women of her acquaintance rarely considered worth discussing. He wrote further of his growing certainty regarding his feelings he confessed had developed almost against his own expectations, during what he had initially believed would be a straightforward courtship, arranged through mutual family connections. He described his admiration for her quiet strength, her practical competence in managing household affairs despite limited resources, and the genuine warmth she extended to everyone around her, despite receiving comparatively little attention or credit for her considerable efforts. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read these words, her heart racing with a confusing mixture of joy and dread. She understood immediately that this letter had never been intended for her sister's eyes, that some clerical error in the delivery had resulted in her receiving correspondence meant to remain entirely private between herself and the Duke, correspondence that revealed feelings he had apparently been unwilling to voice aloud during their brief and carefully monitored conversations. As she finished reading, she heard footsteps approaching, and quickly folded the letter, tucking it into the pocket of her dress, just as her mother rounded the corner into the hallway, inquiring about the morning's post. "Was there anything of significance delivered today?" her mother asked, glancing toward the empty silver tray where correspondence typically waited to be distributed. Eleanor hesitated only briefly, before responding with practiced calm. "Nothing of particular importance, Mother. Simply a note regarding household accounts that I shall attend to later this afternoon." Her mother nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and continued toward the kitchen to discuss the day's meals with the cook, leaving Eleanor alone in the hallway with her racing thoughts, and the letter burning against her side like a small, dangerous secret she had never intended to keep. Throughout the remainder of the day, Eleanor found herself distracted by the letter's contents, unable to fully concentrate on her usual household tasks, as she considered what course of action might be appropriate given the circumstances. She understood that returning the letter to the Duke would require some explanation of why she had opened correspondence not originally intended for her. Yet she also recognized that keeping such knowledge entirely to herself felt somehow dishonest, particularly given the complicated situation already developing between herself, her sister, and the Duke. By evening, she had resolved to write a brief response acknowledging the error and returning the letter to its intended recipient without further comment on its contents, hoping this approach might allow her to navigate the situation with minimal additional complication. Yet even as she composed this careful, measured response, she found herself unable to fully suppress the warmth that had settled in her chest since reading his words, nor the growing certainty that whatever connection had developed between them could not be indefinitely ignored, regardless of how inconvenient the timing might prove. The following morning, Eleanor arranged for a trusted servant to deliver her response directly to the Duke's residence, along with the original letter carefully resealed within a fresh envelope. She included only a brief note explaining the apparent error in delivery and expressing hope that no further complications would arise from the misunderstanding, deliberately avoiding any mention of the feelings his words had stirred within her own uncertain heart. 3 days passed without any response from the Duke, and Eleanor began to wonder whether her careful, distant reply had discouraged him entirely, whether he had perhaps reconsidered his earlier declarations, given the practical difficulties their mutual attraction would inevitably create for both families involved. She told herself this outcome would be for the best, that her duty to her family and her sister's prospects should take precedence over any personal feelings she might harbor, regardless of how genuine or unexpected those feelings had proven to be. Yet on the 4th day, a fresh letter arrived, this time delivered with explicit instructions that it be placed directly and only into Eleanor's hands, leaving no possibility for further confusion regarding its intended recipient. She retreated to her room immediately upon receiving it, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the pages within. This letter proved even more direct than the first, the Duke acknowledging plainly that he understood the complications his feelings created, yet insisting that he could no longer pretend indifference toward her simply for the sake of convenience or propriety. He wrote of his growing conviction that genuine connection, however inconveniently timed or socially complicated, deserved acknowledgement rather than suppression, and he requested, with evident hesitation, whether she might consider a private meeting where they could discuss matters more openly than their previous encounters had allowed. Eleanor read this second letter multiple times throughout the evening, weighing the potential consequences of agreeing to such a meeting against the growing certainty within her own heart that she could no longer entirely deny the feelings his words had confirmed and deepened. She understood that agreeing to meet him privately carried significant risk, both to her own reputation and to whatever fragile relationship remained between herself and her sister, following the tensions that had already emerged since the garden party. Yet as she considered her options throughout the following days, she found herself increasingly unable to imagine simply walking away from this unexpected connection without at least understanding more fully what the Duke intended and what possibilities, however complicated, might exist for their shared future. She composed a careful response, agreeing to meet him during her customary morning walk along the river, choosing this location precisely because it offered both privacy and a plausible explanation should anyone question the circumstances of their encounter. The days leading up to this planned meeting passed slowly, filled with careful preparations for the household's usual affairs, while Eleanor's mind remained largely occupied with anticipation and uncertainty regarding what conversation might unfold once she and the Duke finally spoke openly about the feelings developing between them. She said nothing of these plans to her family, understanding that premature disclosure would only create additional complications before she herself fully understood what direction her own heart wished to pursue. Meanwhile, tensions within the household continued to simmer beneath the surface, with Cassandra's earlier admission regarding her true feelings toward the proposed match, creating an unusual dynamic between the sisters that neither had yet found the words to fully address. Their parents remained largely unaware of the complications developing beneath their roof, continuing to discuss wedding preparations and financial arrangements as though the match between Cassandra and the Duke remained entirely secure and progressing according to plan. Eleanor found herself caught between conflicting obligations during this period, torn between her genuine desire to explore the connection developing between herself and the Duke and her deep sense of responsibility toward her family's precarious financial situation, which depended so heavily upon Cassandra securing this advantageous match, regardless of whether genuine affection existed between the intended couple. She spent long hours during this waiting period, reflecting on her own values and priorities, questioning whether the sacrifice her family expected of her, the sacrifice of remaining perpetually in the background, while her sister claimed whatever happiness or security life offered, truly represented the only acceptable path forward, given the unexpected circumstances that had developed. She thought of her own dreams, long suppressed beneath years of practical duty, and wondered whether she possessed the courage to pursue happiness for herself, even if doing so meant disrupting the careful arrangements her family had constructed around her sister's prospects. By the time the appointed morning finally arrived for her meeting with the Duke, Eleanor had reached no firm conclusions regarding how she wished to proceed, yet she understood with growing certainty that avoiding the conversation entirely would resolve nothing and would likely only prolong the uncertainty that had settled over her household in recent weeks. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing her usual walking attire rather than anything that might suggest special preparation for the encounter, and set out toward the river with her heart racing and her mind full of questions she hoped the coming conversation might finally begin to answer. The financial pressures facing the Whitmore household intensified considerably during the following weeks, as their father received disappointing news regarding a business venture he had invested in heavily, further straining resources that had already grown thin over recent years. This development increased the urgency surrounding Cassandra's potential match with the Duke, with both parents growing visibly anxious about securing the arrangement before their circumstances deteriorated further. Eleanor found herself caught in an increasingly difficult position, aware of her family's mounting desperation, while simultaneously navigating her own uncertain feelings, following the private conversation she had shared with the Duke by the river weeks earlier. During that meeting, he had spoken plainly of his growing affection for her, acknowledging the complications such feelings created, given his ongoing understood courtship with Cassandra, yet insisting that he could not continue pretending an interest in her sister that he genuinely did not feel. Eleanor had responded with equal honesty, admitting that she too had developed feelings she had not sought nor expected, yet expressing deep reservations about pursuing any connection that might damage her family's already precarious financial situation, or create lasting resentment between herself and her sister. They had parted that morning without firm resolution, both agreeing that further time and careful consideration were necessary before proceeding with any decision that might significantly alter their family's expectations. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor threw herself into supporting her family's efforts to present Cassandra favorably to the Duke, hoping that dedicating herself fully to this task might help resolve the internal conflict she continued to experience regarding her own feelings. She helped Cassandra prepare for social engagements, offered suggestions regarding conversation topics likely to interest the Duke, and generally attempted to fade further into the background during his subsequent visits, believing this approach might allow the original courtship to proceed as her parents had always intended. Yet despite her efforts, the Duke's attention during these visits remained noticeably divided, his eyes frequently seeking out Eleanor, even as he maintained proper conversation with Cassandra. Their parents, increasingly focused on the financial urgency of securing the match, seemed largely oblivious to this dynamic, interpreting any hesitation on the Duke's part as simple caution, rather than genuine uncertainty regarding which sister truly held his affection. During one particularly difficult evening, following a visit where the Duke's divided attention had proven especially apparent, Cassandra confronted her sister directly regarding the ongoing situation. "I cannot continue pretending this arrangement remains uncomplicated, Eleanor," Cassandra said, her earlier resentment now tempered by genuine concern for their family's circumstances. "Our parents desperately need this match to succeed, yet it grows increasingly clear that his true interest lies elsewhere." Eleanor struggled to respond, torn between honesty and her continued desire to protect her family's fragile hopes. "I have tried to discourage his attention," she said finally. "Yet I cannot control his feelings, Cassandra, regardless of how much I might wish circumstances were different for the sake of our family's security." Cassandra studied her sister thoughtfully before responding, her expression revealing a complexity of emotion that surprised Eleanor, given the tension that had characterized their relationship in recent weeks. "Perhaps," Cassandra said slowly, "we have both been pursuing paths that were never truly meant for either of us. I have long felt trapped by expectations that never matched my own genuine desires, and I begin to wonder whether continuing to force this match, regardless of where true affection actually lies, serves anyone's genuine happiness." This conversation marked a significant shift in the relationship between the sisters, as Cassandra gradually revealed more of her own private struggles regarding the pressure she had felt to secure an advantageous marriage, regardless of her personal feelings toward the man in question. She confessed to Eleanor that she had long harbored a quiet affection for a family friend of more modest means, a connection she had never dared mention to their parents, given the financial desperation that made such a match seem impossibly impractical. Eleanor listened with growing understanding, recognizing in her sister's confession echoes of her own struggle to reconcile personal happiness with family obligation. The sisters spent several evenings during this period engaged in increasingly honest conversation, gradually building a closeness that had been notably absent during years of Eleanor's quiet self-sacrifice in support of Cassandra's expected prospects. Yet even as understanding grew between the sisters, the practical concerns facing their family remained unresolved. Their father's business difficulties continued to worsen, and both parents grew increasingly insistent that Cassandra secure the Duke's proposal before circumstances deteriorated further, unaware of the complicated emotional landscape that had developed beneath their determined insistence. During one particularly tense family dinner, their father addressed the matter directly, his usual reserved demeanor giving way to visible anxiety regarding their financial future. "We cannot continue as we have been," he said firmly, addressing both daughters, though his attention remained primarily fixed upon Cassandra. "This match with the Duke represents our family's best opportunity for security, and I trust that whatever hesitation has developed on his part will resolve favorably, given sufficient time and appropriate encouragement." Eleanor felt the weight of her father's words pressing heavily upon her conscience, understanding all too well the role her own feelings had played in creating the hesitation he referenced, without fully comprehending its true source. She glanced toward Cassandra, uncertain whether her sister intended to reveal the complications developing between the three of them. Yet Cassandra remained silent throughout the remainder of the meal, apparently unwilling to burden their parents with additional worry, given the family's already precarious circumstances. After dinner concluded, the sisters retreated to Eleanor's room, where Cassandra finally addressed the difficult question both had been avoiding throughout recent weeks. "What do you intend to do, Eleanor?" she asked directly. "Regarding your feelings toward the Duke, and regarding our family's desperate need for this match to succeed, regardless of where genuine affection actually resides." Eleanor sat quietly for several long moments before responding, gathering her thoughts regarding a question she had asked herself repeatedly, without reaching any firm conclusion. "I do not know," she admitted finally. I understand what our family needs, yet I cannot continue pretending indifference toward feelings that have proven far stronger than I ever anticipated or intended. Cassandra nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. Perhaps, she said quietly, it is time we both stopped pretending entirely, regardless of how difficult such honesty might prove for our parents to accept. I have spent years suppressing my own genuine feelings, in service of expectations that never truly served my happiness, and I begin to wonder whether continuing this pattern, for either of us, ultimately serves anyone's genuine well-being. This conversation marked a turning point in Eleanor's own thinking regarding the difficult decision facing her, as she began to seriously consider whether pursuing genuine happiness, however complicated the resulting circumstances might prove, represented a more honest and ultimately more sustainable path forward than continuing to suppress her feelings indefinitely in service of expectations that had never truly accounted for the possibility of her own personal fulfillment. Yet significant obstacles remained before any such path could be pursued, including the practical question of how their family's financial difficulties might be addressed should the expected match with Cassandra ultimately fail to materialize as originally planned. The private walk had been arranged with unusual care, Eleanor and the Duke meeting once again along the familiar riverbank path, where their earlier conversations had first revealed the depth of feeling developing between them. This time, however, both approached the meeting with greater clarity regarding their own hearts, having spent recent weeks reflecting seriously on the complicated circumstances surrounding their mutual attraction. I have thought of little else since our last conversation here, the Duke said, as they began walking together along the familiar path, the morning sun casting gentle light across the water beside them. I understand the difficulties my feelings create for your family's circumstances, yet I find myself increasingly unwilling to continue pretending interest in a match that was never truly meant to be between myself and your sister. Eleanor walked beside him in thoughtful silence for several moments, before responding, weighing her words carefully, given the significance of the conversation unfolding between them. My sister has confessed her own reservations regarding the match, she said finally. She has long harbored genuine affection elsewhere, affection she suppressed believing our family's circumstances required her to pursue a more advantageous arrangement regardless of her personal happiness. The Duke stopped walking, turning to face Eleanor directly, with an expression of evident relief mixed with continued uncertainty. Then perhaps, he said carefully, the path forward proves less complicated than we originally believed, though significant obstacles surely remain regarding your family's practical circumstances and expectations. Eleanor nodded, understanding the truth of his observation. My family depends heavily upon an advantageous match to address our current financial difficulties, she said honestly. I cannot simply dismiss this reality, regardless of my own feelings, nor can I in good conscience pursue personal happiness while ignoring the genuine needs of those who depend upon me. The Duke considered her words thoughtfully before responding, his expression revealing careful deliberation rather than the impulsive enthusiasm that might have characterized a less serious suitor. I understand your concern, he said finally, yet I wonder whether you have fully considered that my own interest in you was never contingent upon any dowry or financial arrangement, and that whatever assistance your family requires might be addressed independently of whether our own connection ultimately develops into something more permanent. Eleanor stared at him in surprise, uncertain how to process this unexpected suggestion. Your Grace, she said carefully, surely you understand the impropriety of suggesting financial assistance disconnected from any formal arrangement between our families. Perhaps, he acknowledged, though his tone remained steady and sincere. Yet I find myself increasingly convinced that genuine connection, the kind I have discovered with you during our brief but meaningful conversations, deserves consideration entirely separate from practical financial calculations that have traditionally governed such arrangements. I have never been the sort of man who values convenience over genuine affection, and I do not intend to begin now, regardless of how unusual my approach might seem, compared to typical expectations. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, at the sincerity evident in his words, tears she attempted to blink away as she processed the magnitude of what he seemed to be suggesting. Are you saying, she asked carefully, that you intend to pursue a connection with me directly, regardless of the complications this creates for my family's original expectations regarding my sister? That is precisely what I am saying, he confirmed, his own expression revealing genuine emotion beneath his usually composed demeanor. I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of the feelings I have developed for you, Eleanor. Feelings that have grown steadily since our first conversation over tea, when I recognized in you a depth of character and genuine warmth that far exceeded anything I had previously encountered in society. Eleanor felt her heart racing at his direct use of her given name, a familiarity that carried significant weight given the formal conventions typically governing their interactions. Your Grace, she began, though he gently interrupted before she could continue. Julian, he said softly, I would ask that you use my given name, if you feel able, given the depth of feeling I have shared with you this morning. Eleanor smiled, despite the tears still gathering in her eyes, feeling something within her chest loosen that had remained tightly bound for years of quiet self-sacrifice and suppressed personal desire. Julian, she repeated softly, testing the unfamiliar intimacy of his name upon her tongue. They continued walking together for a considerable time following this exchange, discussing more openly than ever before the practical challenges that would need to be addressed should they choose to pursue their connection formally, including the delicate matter of explaining the shift in circumstances to Eleanor's parents, who remained entirely focused upon securing Cassandra's match, rather than considering any alternative arrangement. Julian expressed his willingness to speak directly with Eleanor's father regarding both his genuine feelings toward Eleanor and his intention to assist the family's financial difficulties, regardless of whether such assistance ultimately resulted in a formal marriage arrangement between himself and Eleanor. This offer, while generous, created its own complications, as Eleanor worried about how such assistance might appear to others in society, potentially suggesting improper motivations behind the Duke's interest in her family. I understand your concern regarding appearances, Julian acknowledged as they discussed this delicate matter. Yet I believe genuine intentions, clearly communicated and honestly pursued, will ultimately prove more sustainable than continuing to maintain a courtship charade that serves no one's true happiness or well-being. Eleanor found herself increasingly convinced by his reasoning, though she remained uncertain how her parents might initially react to such an unexpected shift in circumstances, particularly given their evident desperation regarding the family's financial situation and their firm expectation that Cassandra would secure the advantageous match they had spent considerable effort cultivating. As their conversation drew toward its conclusion, Julian raised a question that had clearly been weighing upon his mind throughout their extended discussion. Do you believe your feelings toward me, he asked carefully, have developed into something genuine and lasting? Or do you fear that circumstances and gratitude for my attention might be creating an illusion of affection that would not withstand the test of time and continued acquaintance? Eleanor considered this question seriously before responding, understanding the importance of honest reflection, given the significant decisions facing both of them. I have asked myself this same question repeatedly, she admitted, yet I find that my feelings toward you have only deepened with continued reflection, rather than diminishing, as might be expected of a fleeting infatuation, born of unusual circumstances. I admire your character, your thoughtfulness, and the genuine respect you have shown me despite my lack of the social advantages typically expected in a woman of your intended station. Julian smiled warmly at this response, evident relief and happiness crossing his features. Then perhaps, he said gently, we might begin considering how best to proceed, understanding that significant challenges remain before us, yet believing that our shared conviction regarding the genuine nature of our connection will ultimately prove sufficient to overcome whatever obstacles arise in the coming weeks. They parted that morning with a shared understanding that circumstances would soon require difficult conversations with Eleanor's family, conversations that would need to address both the complicated emotional reality that had developed between them and the practical financial concerns that continued to weigh heavily upon the Whitmore household's future prospects and security. The revelation to their parents occurred sooner than either Eleanor or Julian had anticipated, precipitated by an unexpected visit from Julian himself, who arrived at the Whitmore household requesting a private conversation with Eleanor's father regarding matters he described as requiring immediate and serious discussion. Eleanor's father received this request with visible confusion, having expected any such private conversation to eventually occur regarding formal arrangements with Cassandra, rather than any unexpected matter involving his elder daughter. He agreed nonetheless to meet privately with the Duke in his study, while Eleanor waited anxiously in the hallway outside, uncertain how her father might react to the honest explanation Julian intended to provide. The conversation between the two men lasted considerably longer than Eleanor had expected, and she paced nervously throughout the house during this period, unable to settle her mind sufficiently to focus on any of her usual household tasks. Cassandra found her sister in this state of evident anxiety and offered quiet reassurance, having herself grown increasingly supportive of the unexpected connection developing between Eleanor and the Duke since their own honest conversation weeks earlier. "Whatever happens," Cassandra said gently, placing a comforting hand upon her sister's arm, "know that I stand fully in support of your happiness, Eleanor. You have spent years supporting my prospects without complaint, and it is long past time that your own genuine feelings receive the consideration and respect they deserve." Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand gratefully, deeply moved by this unexpected support, given the tension that had characterized their relationship only weeks earlier. "Thank you, Cassandra," she said sincerely. "I could not have imagined navigating this difficult situation without your understanding and support." Finally, after what felt like an interminable wait, Eleanor's father emerged from his study, his expression difficult to read, as he requested that Eleanor join him immediately for a private conversation. Eleanor followed him into the study with considerable trepidation, uncertain what reaction awaited her following whatever discussion had occurred between her father and Julian. Once seated, her father regarded her with an expression that combined surprise, concern, and something that might have been cautious relief. "The Duke has explained a rather unexpected situation to me," he began carefully. "He claims to have developed genuine affection for you rather than your sister, and he has offered assistance regarding our family's financial difficulties, regardless of whether this connection ultimately results in a formal marriage arrangement." Eleanor nodded, confirming the truth of this explanation. "I did not seek his attention, father," she said honestly. "Yet I cannot deny that genuine feeling has developed between us, feeling I have tried repeatedly to suppress given my understanding of our family's need for Cassandra's match to succeed as originally planned." Her father sat quietly for several moments, processing this information with evident difficulty, given how thoroughly it upended expectations he had held firmly for many weeks. "And your sister?" he asked finally. "How does she feel regarding this unexpected turn of circumstances?" "Cassandra has confessed her own reservations regarding the match," Eleanor explained carefully. "She has long harbored feelings for another, feelings she suppressed believing our family's circumstances required a more advantageous arrangement regardless of her personal happiness." This revelation seemed to trouble her father even more than the initial news regarding Eleanor and Julian's developing connection, and he sat in troubled silence for several long moments before finally speaking again. "I confess I had no idea either of my daughters harbored such significant reservations regarding arrangements I believed served our family's best interests," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "Perhaps I have focused too exclusively upon practical necessity, without adequately considering the genuine happiness of my own children." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes at this unexpected acknowledgement from her father, whose stern practicality had rarely given way to such open emotional reflection throughout her lifetime. "Father," she said gently, "we understand the pressures you and Mother have faced regarding our family's circumstances. Neither Cassandra nor I intended to create additional difficulty through our respective feelings, yet we could not continue indefinitely suppressing genuine emotion in service of arrangements that ultimately served no one's true happiness." Her father nodded slowly, apparently reaching some internal resolution regarding how to proceed given this unexpected complexity. "The Duke has offered generous assistance regarding our financial difficulties," he said finally. "Assistance, he insists, carries no conditions regarding formal arrangements between our families. I confess I find myself deeply moved by such genuine generosity, particularly given his clear insistence that his primary motivation involves genuine affection for you, rather than any practical calculation." Eleanor waited anxiously for her father's ultimate decision regarding how the family should proceed, given these unexpected revelations. Uncertain whether he would insist upon maintaining the original arrangement with Cassandra, despite her sister's evident reservations, or whether he might prove willing to consider an entirely different path forward that better accounted for both daughters' genuine happiness and well-being. After several more moments of careful consideration, her father finally spoke again, his tone carrying newfound resolve. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we must reconsider our approach entirely. If Cassandra harbors genuine feelings for another suitable gentleman, and if you and the Duke have developed authentic mutual affection, despite the unusual circumstances of your acquaintance, then perhaps continuing to force an arrangement that serves neither daughter's genuine happiness represents a mistake I am unwilling to perpetuate, simply for the sake of financial convenience." Eleanor felt overwhelming relief wash over her at these words, understanding that her father had chosen to prioritize his daughter's genuine happiness over the practical financial calculations that had governed the family's approach for so many difficult weeks. "Thank you, Father," she said sincerely, tears now falling freely as the weight of accumulated tension finally began to ease. Her father reached across his desk to take her hand gently, an unusual display of physical affection given his typically reserved demeanor. "I only wish for both my daughter's happiness, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I regret that financial necessity nearly caused me to overlook this fundamental priority in favor of practical convenience." This conversation marked a significant turning point for the entire Whitmore family, as word gradually spread regarding the unexpected shift in circumstances. With Julian's continued generous assistance addressing the family's most pressing financial concerns, while simultaneously freeing both sisters to pursue relationships based on genuine affection, rather than desperate practical necessity. Yet significant challenges remained before either sister could fully claim the happiness now within reach, including the difficult task of managing society's inevitable curiosity and judgment regarding such an unusual and unexpected turn of events within a family previously known for conventional propriety and careful adherence to expected social arrangements. News of the unexpected shift in the Duke's affections spread through local society with remarkable speed, generating exactly the kind of speculative gossip Eleanor had long dreaded throughout her quiet, unassuming life within her family's modest household. Within days of her father's decision to release Cassandra from any obligation toward the original arrangement, whispers circulated throughout every drawing room and social gathering regarding the unusual circumstances that had led the Duke to abandon his courtship of the younger, more conventionally celebrated Whitmore sister in favor of her plainer, quieter elder sibling. Eleanor found herself the subject of unprecedented attention wherever she traveled, attention that felt deeply uncomfortable given her years of deliberately maintaining a low profile within local society. Acquaintances who had previously shown little interest in her now approached with pointed questions regarding her unexpected connection with the Duke, their curiosity often barely masking skepticism regarding whether such an unlikely match could possibly prove genuine, rather than some elaborate misunderstanding destined to resolve itself favorably for the more obviously suitable younger sister. During a visit to town for necessary shopping, Eleanor encountered several prominent society matrons who made little effort to disguise their doubtful expressions as they offered carefully worded congratulations regarding her unexpected good fortune. "Such an interesting turn of events," one particularly outspoken woman remarked, her tone carrying clear implication that she considered the entire situation somewhat scandalous, despite its outwardly respectable resolution. "One does wonder what qualities the Duke discovered in you that he failed to appreciate initially in your considerably more accomplished sister." Eleanor felt the sting of this deliberately pointed comment, understanding that such skepticism would likely continue for some time, regardless of how genuine her connection with Julian actually proved to be. She responded with careful politeness, deflecting the implied criticism without directly confronting the woman's evident disapproval, though the exchange left her feeling shaken and uncertain regarding how she might navigate continued social scrutiny of this nature. That evening, she confided her concerns to Julian during one of their now more openly acknowledged meetings, worried that such persistent skepticism might eventually prove damaging to his reputation and standing within society, regardless of his own evident conviction regarding the genuine nature of their connection. "I do not wish to become a source of embarrassment for you," she admitted honestly. "Perhaps society's doubts carry legitimate concern regarding whether I truly possess the qualities expected of someone in your position." Julian listened to her worries with evident patience before responding firmly. "Eleanor," he said, his tone carrying genuine conviction, "I care little for the opinions of those who judge based on superficial comparison, rather than genuine understanding of character. Your worth has never depended upon society's approval, and I refuse to allow their narrow judgment to diminish what I know to be true regarding the depth of your character and the genuine nature of the connection we share." Despite his reassurance, Eleanor continued to struggle with the persistent scrutiny that accompanied her new position, as the subject of considerable social speculation. She noticed subtle changes in how acquaintances treated her, some suddenly eager to claim closer friendship now that her connection with the Duke suggested elevated future status, while others maintained obvious skepticism regarding whether such an unlikely match could genuinely prove lasting. During this challenging period, Eleanor found unexpected support from her sister Cassandra, whose own circumstances had similarly shifted following their father's decision to release her from the original expected arrangement. Cassandra had begun quietly pursuing her own genuine affection for the modest gentleman she had long secretly admired, and the sisters found themselves united in navigating society's curious and often judgmental response to their family's unconventional circumstances. We must simply demonstrate through our actions that genuine happiness matters more than conventional expectation, Cassandra observed during one quiet evening conversation between the sisters. Society will eventually grow accustomed to our unusual circumstances, particularly once they witness the genuine contentment both of us have found through pursuing authentic connection, rather than merely convenient arrangement. Eleanor found comfort in her sister's perspective, gradually developing greater confidence in facing society's continued scrutiny as weeks passed, and her connection with Julian continued to deepen and strengthen. Despite ongoing external skepticism, she began to recognize that her own quiet strength, the very qualities that had initially drawn Julian's genuine affection, could similarly serve to gradually overcome society's doubtful judgment regarding her suitability for the elevated position she now unexpectedly occupied. Julian, for his part, remained steadfast throughout this challenging period, publicly demonstrating his genuine affection and respect for Eleanor through consistent attention and evident pride in her company during social gatherings where they appeared together. His unwavering conviction gradually began influencing broader social opinion, as observers noted the genuine warmth and mutual respect evident between them, qualities that stood in notable contrast to the more calculated and superficial arrangements typical of society matches, motivated primarily by financial or social advantage. Gradually, as weeks passed and the initial shock of the unusual situation began to fade, Eleanor noticed subtle shifts in how society regarded her, with genuine curiosity increasingly replacing outright skepticism, as observers recognized the evident authenticity of the connection she shared with Julian. Yet she understood that fully overcoming society's judgment would require continued patience and consistent demonstration of the genuine character that had originally drawn Julian's attention, despite her lack of conventional advantages typically expected in such an elevated match. As the formal ball approached that would mark the next significant step in her relationship with Julian, Eleanor found herself reflecting seriously on how far she had traveled from the quiet, overlooked woman who had once believed her role in life involved perpetual sacrifice in service of her more celebrated sister's prospects. She recognized that claiming her own happiness, however uncomfortable the accompanying scrutiny might prove, represented an important step toward fully embracing the genuine worth and dignity she had long overlooked within herself. Worth that Julian had recognized from their very first conversation over a simple cup of tea. The formal ball marking the official announcement of Eleanor and Julian's engagement had been anticipated by society for weeks, with considerable speculation continuing regarding how the unusual couple might present themselves publicly following months of persistent gossip and skeptical commentary regarding their unlikely match. Eleanor spent the afternoon preparing carefully, aware that this evening would likely determine whether society ultimately accepted her elevated position or continued regarding her connection with Julian as some passing curiosity destined for eventual disappointment. Her mother, now fully supportive of the match given the genuine happiness evident in her elder daughter following months of careful courtship, helped arrange Eleanor's appearance with considerable care, selecting a gown that complemented her natural grace, without attempting to disguise the practical, unpretentious character that had always defined her personality. "You need not become someone else entirely to claim this happiness, Eleanor," her mother observed while adjusting the final details of her daughter's appearance. "Julian fell in love with the woman you have always been, not some elaborate transformation designed to satisfy society's narrow expectations." Cassandra, radiant in her own happiness following the recent formalization of her engagement to the gentleman she had long secretly admired, assisted with final preparations, while offering encouraging words regarding the evening ahead. "You have nothing to prove tonight, Eleanor," she said firmly. "Simply be yourself, and allow Julian's evident devotion to speak clearly regarding the genuine nature of your connection." When Eleanor arrived at the grand ballroom that evening, accompanying Julian as his acknowledged intended bride for the first time in such a public, formal setting. She felt the weight of countless curious glances following her entrance, exactly the scrutiny she had anticipated and dreaded throughout recent months of persistent gossip. Yet she found unexpected strength in Julian's steady presence beside her, his hand resting protectively at her back as they moved through the crowded room, greeting various acquaintances and prominent society members. Throughout the evening, Julian made a point of publicly demonstrating his genuine affection and respect for Eleanor, introducing her to important connections with evident pride, seeking her opinion openly during conversations regarding various topics, and generally treating her with the kind of respectful attention that left little doubt regarding the authentic nature of their connection. Several observers who had previously expressed skepticism regarding the match found themselves gradually reconsidering their earlier judgment as the evening progressed, witnessing firsthand the genuine warmth and mutual respect that characterized the couple's interactions. During a formal moment arranged specifically for this purpose, Julian requested the attention of the assembled guests, drawing Eleanor gently to stand beside him as he prepared to address the crowd directly regarding their upcoming marriage. The room fell into expectant silence as guests turned their attention toward the couple, curious to hear how the Duke might address the persistent speculation that had surrounded their unusual courtship throughout recent months. "I understand that many among you have found our engagement somewhat unexpected," Julian began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the assembled gathering. "Perhaps some among you continue to wonder what qualities led me to choose Eleanor over the more conventionally celebrated match, originally anticipated by both our families." Eleanor felt her heart racing as he continued speaking, uncertain what direction his public address might take given the sensitive nature of the topic he had chosen to confront directly before the assembled crowd. "I discovered in Eleanor," Julian continued, "a woman of genuine depth, quiet strength, and authentic character that far exceeded anything I encountered during countless previous social engagements, designed to identify a suitable match based primarily on superficial qualities and social convenience. She listens with genuine attention, rather than performing polite interest. She demonstrates grace and competence in managing difficult circumstances without seeking recognition or praise for her considerable efforts. She possesses a thoughtfulness and intellectual curiosity that I find endlessly engaging, qualities I had never previously encountered, combined so completely within a single remarkable person." The room remained silent, guests listening with rapt attention as Julian continued his unexpected public declaration, his words carrying evident sincerity that gradually began shifting the skeptical atmosphere that had characterized society's response to their engagement throughout recent months. "I did not choose Eleanor despite society's initial expectations," he continued firmly. "I chose her because I recognized in her the genuine qualities I had always hoped to find in a partner. Qualities that matter far more to lasting happiness than conventional beauty or social prominence, however admirable those qualities might prove in other circumstances. She served me tea during our very first meeting with such genuine care and attention that I recognized immediately I had encountered someone truly exceptional, someone whose worth had perhaps been overlooked by others, too focused on more superficial and conventional measures of feminine accomplishment." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as Julian continued speaking, moved beyond words by the public conviction and genuine affection evident throughout his unexpected address to the assembled gathering. She glanced around the room, noticing several previously skeptical faces, now displaying evident sympathy and understanding, their earlier doubt gradually replaced by genuine appreciation for the authentic connection so clearly evident between the couple. "I ask that you extend to Eleanor the same respect and warmth you would offer any woman who has earned my genuine devotion," Julian concluded, turning to face Eleanor directly as he spoke his final words. "For she is, without question, precisely the woman I chose, not through convenient circumstance or family arrangement, but through genuine recognition of the remarkable person she has always been." The room erupted into warm applause following this heartfelt declaration. Guests who had previously harbored skepticism, now visibly moved by the evident sincerity and genuine devotion Julian had expressed so publicly and completely. Eleanor felt overwhelming emotion as she looked upon the man who had recognized her worth when society had long overlooked it, who had chosen genuine connection over convenient convention, and who had publicly declared his devotion before the very society that had once dismissed her as merely the plain, practical elder sister, destined to remain forever in her more celebrated sibling's shadow. As the evening continued, Eleanor found herself moving through the celebration with newfound confidence, no longer the overlooked woman who had once poured tea unseen in the corner of countless gatherings, but rather a woman fully recognized and celebrated for the genuine character and quiet strength that had ultimately proven far more valuable than any conventional measure of social accomplishment. She danced that evening with Julian before the assembled crowd, no longer hiding in shadows or corners, but standing proudly beside the man who had seen her true worth from their very first meeting, when she had simply served him tea, and, in doing so, unknowingly begun the remarkable journey that would ultimately transform both their lives entirely and completely.